Hello. This week on Ask a Priest Live, we covered a lot of ground. We started with evangelization, then we went to Cardinals, and then covered the Pope's recent comments. I hope you enjoy. All right, now Father Guillermo says, I can hear the Cardinals singing in the backyard there. Any opinion on the Cardinal appointments? What's the deal with a non-bishop, Father Cantalamessa, appointed Cardinal? Great. Yes, cardinals are singing in the backyard. I think that's the other kind of cardinal that you're talking about. Yeah, so I haven't had a chance to really look at the details, but I did hear that basically one of the priests was, or one of the cardinals that was appointed was a priest, and so that's a very interesting thing. Historically, actually, all of the cardinals were priests. So the cardinals were essentially, they were the pastors of the parishes of Rome, historically. Basically, they were the kind of highest ranking priests in the Diocese of Rome, and they were a group of people who would advise the Pope, but really their primary duty, since who names the new pope? It's, the Pope names the other bishops, but who names the Pope? Well, it was all of the pastors of Rome would get together and they would vote for who their new Pope would be, who the new Bishop of Rome would be. And so, historically, all of the cardinals were bishops. Then, essentially, the concept of cardinal kept expanding, and it became more of an honorary title that still kept its role as the person who votes for the Pope, but it also kind of expanded a little bit, and some bishops were named cardinals, and even some deacons were named cardinals, and still actually there's it's really, really complicated. To add just another layer to the complication with cardinals, you have cardinal bishops, cardinal priests, and cardinal deacons. So within the cardinals there are three ranks, but just because a cardinal is ordained a priest or ordained a bishop, or a priest, that doesn't mean that they're actually a cardinal bishop and a cardinal priest, respectively. So the cardinal bishop, priest, and deacon is completely disconnected from what their ordination is, and then in their ordination they can be a deacon, a priest, or a bishop. In recent history, they've all been bishops, and they are now named as titulars of the main churches in Rome, essentially, that historically were those parishes of Rome. And so they still have some sort of responsibility over that particular church in Rome, but oftentimes they have another job, which would be in some other country as an archbishop, or perhaps in some role in the Vatican, or in the diplomatic corps, or something of that sort. And so, really, for me, the idea of naming a priest as a cardinal is kind of like, okay, like, I don't know why we moved to only bishops in the first place, but it doesn't seem like it's that big of a deal. If he wants to name a priest, sure, knock yourself out. He's the Pope. He can do whatever he wants. And Father Cantalamessa has been the papal preacher for years and years and years, and he's a very faithful priest. And so I think probably if you're going to choose a cardinal, that's probably a good choice. All right. Through history, we have had a few Greek popes. What would happen if an Eastern Catholic cardinal is elected pope? What about papal liturgies, vestments, etc.? That is an excellent question. So if he is elected pope, he necessarily is the bishop of a Roman church, and so he would still celebrate the Roman rite. So, in a sense, he would just have to start using all of the other vestments. As far as his clerical garb goes, I'm not really sure how that would work. I have no idea. I think when we had the Greek popes, it was back when there was not a huge difference in the clerical garb between the different churches, and so I can't tell you historically on that. But essentially the bishops would always celebrate whatever the local liturgy was. So prior to the Council of Trent, and even also a little bit prior to the Second Vatican Council, there were lots and lots of different rites for all of the different locations. And if a bishop got sent to that other location, he would just pick up the rite of that place. And so assumably that would also happen now if an Eastern Rite bishop were to be named Bishop of Rome. Great question. Things that only priests think of, right? All right, next question. It says, what's the deal with the recent fad of questioning the validity, or at least pertinence, of Vatican II? Yeah, man. So that's something that has been happening for a long time, but it does seem that there's a new resurgence of that happening somewhat recently, and I'm not really sure why it's happening recently, but the general question that is asked is, so the Second Vatican Council, it was called by a pope, but it was called for a pastoral purpose, and it was called a pastoral council when it was called. And so does that mean that it's not an ecumenical council, which means that the documents are not intended to teach the dogma or doctrine of the church? And, you can have a lot of different opinions about that. My personal opinion is that at the very least, the dogmatic constitutions, there's a dogmatic constitution on the church, Lumen Gentium, is pretty clearly a dogmatic constitution, like they meant to actually teach dogma, and it was voted on by all of the bishops, it was in a universal council, at least, even if it wasn't ecumenical, and it was ratified by the Pope. And so I think that definitely fits into the category of something which we owe assent to, we owe the act of faith towards. In regard to a lot of the other documents, I think a lot of them, they don't really teach on matters of faith and morals, and if they do, they don't really say anything new. And so if you want to disagree with that stuff, at least the things that, they're not saying any, or that they're saying new things, but not about faith and morals, as always, you can choose to disagree with that. And as long as you have a very well-founded reason for that, then, knock yourself out. It's considered to be generally imprudent to disagree with the universal bishops of the church. But, they all can be wrong as well. And you can be right. And so just be really sure that that's the case, if that's what you think. So, Joan McNett says, good afternoon. In the Francesco documentary, what do you think about what do you think Pope Francis was really wanting to say about the convivencia? Yeah, so let's go ahead and jump into that, because that is complicated and it all needs to be explained. All right, so I'm going to try and do this through the full pertinent timeline. In 2018, there was an interview that Pope Francis gave to a Mexican journalist, and that was recorded by the Vatican. Like, they used the Vatican Communication Office, cameras, lighting, microphones, everything. They recorded it, but the Mexican entrevista, the journalist, came in and interviewed the Pope and asked all the questions. That is actually when the Pope said that statement that there need to be laws to provide for a convivencia civil, is the term that was used. But because that was such a, I don't know if that's if we want the Pope on camera saying that, it was cut out. And they sent certain other parts to this Mexican journalist, who then put it all together and published that interview. Then, now in 2020, we have the Francesco documentary coming out, and that was a whole compilation of a lot of different interviews. Shortly before the Francesco documentary came out, The director of the film said that he was in the interview when Pope Francis, um, made the comments about civil unions. Um, then the documentary came out just this past Wednesday, I think it was. Um, and in Spanish, what the Pope proposes is convivencia civil, which we'll get into that in a second, but the subtitles translate that as civil union. And so, essentially, if you look at the subtitles, this clearly states that the Pope is supporting laws for homosexual civil unions. So, obviously, that's kind of problematic. And that story broke pretty much immediately after the premiere in Rome, and it hit all of the news platforms, even in in lots of different languages. It wasn't something that like, oh yeah, it was just the English-speaking news or the Italian-speaking news or anything like that. Like it hit everybody, and because it spreads so quickly and in so many different languages, a lot of kind of fake news ends up just following one particular language path, but it really made it across all of them, and it hit some really big news channels. A lot of people immediately started reacting very strongly to that, understandably. However, on Thursday, the original film, or the footage, came out from the Francesco documentary, and essentially it has the Pope speaking in, he talks about how gay people should be accepted and loved, they're children of God, they can't be thrown out of a family, things of that sort. And then he says, and that's why we need laws to provide for this convivencia civil. And then he says, I fought for that. But that, it seems, is in a different interview. It has different lighting. And so, once that all came out on Thursday, then there was a big discussion about what convivencia civil actually means. And it's complicated what it means. So convivencia civil in Spanish, in a very colloquial sense, it just means like a civil coexistence. And so, almost you would talk about like a convivencia civil if there were two roommates that just really didn't get along, but they were in a contract together and so they couldn't get out. Like they would sit down together and they would say, like, okay, let's just figure out how we can have a convivencia civil, because we're kind of stuck together, so let's at least have a civil life, so that's the kind of like common Spanish understanding of it. That gets a little bit more complicated when you talk about it within a theological context, because convivencia, speaking of marriage and families and things of that sort, the convivencia conyugal is what we talk about as conjugal life, or that the actual living together of two spouses. And so this word convivencia does have a very spousal undertone in theology itself. Then there's a whole nother layer of complication when you think about the Argentinian Spanish and the legal tradition for civil unions and things of the sort in Argentina. Because the word for civil union in ordinary Spanish, like here in Texas, all of the Hispanics around here talk about civil unions as uniones civiles. That's how it's referred to. But in Argentina, they talk about it as unión convivencial. And so they actually use this word convivencia, convivencial, to describe that specific thing, a civil union. And so the words themselves are not super clear. It's kind of an ambiguous thing. And so it's tough to really pin down one or the other. And then you've got some people who know Francis very intimately and who have known him for a long time, who have now gone onto social media and said, no, when the Pope says convivencia civil, that's precisely what he means. He means civil union. And so it's kind of like, oh gosh, all the Pope's friends are now all saying, like, no, he actually meant what we were hoping he didn't mean. But then it's also kind of odd because, first off, he is the Pope, right? And so we should just kind of assume that what he says is actually in accord with church teaching, because, he's the Pope. But then also there have been several points in his life as a bishop and life as a pope in which he's fairly clearly stated that he's not for civil unions. There have been a few points where it's been a little bit muddy and he might have actually kind of supported it, but it's just not clear at those times. And so if you look kind of at the trajectory of the Pope's teaching and belief and the statements that he's made, plus you add in the fact that he is, the Pope of the Catholic Church, plus the fact that it's very ambiguous, you just kind of hope that what he actually meant was we have to come up with laws to have a kind of civil coexistence with people who are, who have same-sex attraction. Then things continued to come out, and it turns out that this statement that he made about the convivencia civil was actually from the Mexico, or the interview with the Mexican journalist from 2018, and the full clip there was it included a statement where he said, and that wouldn't presume any sort of homosexual actions when he was talking about that. And so it actually seems that perhaps in that original interview, the Pope was supporting some sort of a law which would protect two people of the same sex to live together in some way that somehow somewhat resembled marriage, but that then wouldn't include any homosexual acts. And so then you kind of end up in this odd situation where you're like, okay, well, so there wouldn't be any mortal sin in that, but then also, like, then it's just kind of like, well, then what does that look like, right? Nobody really knows. So it's all very, very, it's very complicated. Yeah. What was he really wanting to say about it? It seems that in the 2018 interview, he was supporting some sort of a law that would allow for cohabitation, civilly protected cohabitation of people of the same sex, but that wouldn't include any sort of homosexual acts. So that seems to be where we're at right now. Alfonso actually just posted one there. So he says, why do bishops bless the crowd with the Book of Gospels? Yeah, that's a great question. So you actually see this more in the Eastern tradition than you do in the Roman tradition, that things are used to bless people sometimes. And so, for example, they have the hand crosses you'll see a lot of times in the Eastern churches. They've got some really cool blessings that they do with those. You can also think of, in the Roman tradition, we have benediction, where we actually use the Eucharist to bless people. And so one of the ancient traditions was, well, here is something sacred. So just like the image of the cross is sacred with the hand crosses, and certainly the Blessed Sacrament is sacred with the monstrance when we give benediction. So also the Book of the Gospels is a particularly sacred thing, and so we can actually use it to bless other people. And for whatever reason, that became reserved in the Roman Rite to just bishops, and so it's a certain privilege that they have. Exactly why only bishops were allowed to do it and not priests, I have no idea. You've stumped me on that one. If anybody does know the answer, please go ahead and reply to Alfonso why it was reserved just to bishops. But that practice of using holy things to bless people is something that we've used in the church for years and years. Oh, and Cindy also asked the question, why won't the Pope make a clarifying statement? Cindy, I can't really answer for the Pope on that one. I don't know. Yeah, it's complicated. I think it'd be it would be nice if he would just say, no, 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 I meant this, so that at least it was all clear. But there's also, in my experience, living with and working with kind of Argentinians and people of that culture, and then also working with Jesuits, they kind of thrive in ambiguity. They're okay with not everybody understanding everything perfectly. I think in our kind of British, Germanic, North countries culture, we really like things to be very, very clear, but not all cultures are like that. They kind of are okay with people not really understanding everything. And I mean, you can imagine, from the Pope's point of view, like, well, I can make a clarification, but really people who are pro same-sex civil unions, they all love me right now, and maybe they'll start actually listening to me. And people who are against that, well, they already know what the church teaches anyways, and so they're not going to really change their thought, because it doesn't matter what the Pope says in his personal opinion. And so there's some of that going on, I think. But I don't really know the exact reason why he hasn't answered that. Great. And then Alfonso also has the question, why do bishops remove their zucchetto already at the preface? So there's just the practice of removing your hat at the holiest times. And that's something that has existed, really for a very long time. And so, you see the miters come off. Also, if your priest celebrates the extraordinary form or just uses a beretta, he'll take that off at the holier time, so whenever you're praying or things of the sort. And then the zucchetto as a kind of mini hat that goes on under the mitre, the tall hat for the bishop, that comes off only at that very holiest time, right before the preface, which is actually the beginning of the Eucharistic prayer. And so it stays off basically from the Eucharistic prayer all the way until the end of the communion. Basically until the Blessed Sacrament is reserved. So it's a sign that is the holiest time in the Mass. All right, Alfonso, great questions. Good stuff. Why do only archbishops and the Pope wear the pallium? So the pallium it's an ancient symbol of authority that really goes all the way back to Roman times, when there was something that was very similar that was worn by certain of the highest Roman officials. And so it was reserved to the very highest officials, just like, and so also in the Catholic Church, we reserve it only to the bishops who are bishops of metropolitan sees. So Rome is a metropolitan see, and then all of the archbishops are the bishops of metropolitan sees. And it's kind of neat. They actually have, they bring all of these sheep into Rome, and the Pope blesses them before they're then all sheared to make these pallia, which are, there's essentially a little strip that goes down, and then it goes up around their shoulders, and then also a strip that goes down the back, that they wear over the chasuble when they're celebrating Mass. And so there's that connection with, wearing the wool of the lamb, so that they're in a sense making themselves like Jesus Christ the Lamb, but also the wool of the lamb in a sense symbolizes the sheep that they are called to pasture and to carry to the green pastures. And so they wear it upon their shoulders as a sign of being the good shepherd, carrying the sheep. And then also on the pallium, there are crosses with nails pinned to them, and there are 5 of those, specifically marking the 5 wounds of Christ. And so it's also kind of a reminder of the yoke of the cross that they put upon themselves in taking such a high office in the church. So it's a really cool kind of symbolic thing that archbishops wear. Pallium, that's what it's called.